Okay, we're going to finish up our blood unit here with the last lecture. So as we said before, blood is connective tissue because what makes something connective tissue is its cells that exist in a matrix. So unlike any of the other connective tissue, blood is liquid, but it's still technically connective tissue because the cells that we've talked about up to this point are the red blood cells or erythrocytes, the white blood cells or leukocytes, the platelets, which are thrombocytes, and then lastly, the actual matrix, the thing that it lives in, these cells live in, is going to be the plasma, the liquid portion of the blood. Now, we did the white blood cell lecture in the last lecture, but I did forget this one slide to be part of that presentation, and that's just about white blood cell count. So, and I didn't want to skip it because that's important. When you go to the doctor, one of the biggest indications that you have of somebody's health in terms of what type of infection they're dealing with is something called a white blood cell count. So if you go to the doctor and you have a fever and they can't really figure out what's going on, they'll probably take your blood and they'll analyze it and they'll look to see how your levels are. Do you have normal levels of white blood cells? And if they're high or low, they're going to take a look at it even further and see, all right, are there more eosinophils? Are there more basophils? What do the lymphocyte numbers look like? And from that, they can actually get a lot of information. So the average adult human has between 5 to 10,000 white blood cells per millimeter cubed. Now, again, just as a reference point, we have 4 to 6 million red blood cells per millimeter cubed. So the red blood cells far outnumber the white blood cells. But normally you have 5 to 10,000. So if you have a higher number than that, that is called leukocytosis. Leuko refers to white blood cells. And that is a scenario where you have above 10,000. So that would be usually caused by one of two things. An infection is probably, if you're sick, if you have other symptoms, it's an infection. But also your white blood cell count can go up if you are in the middle of training. So like if you're in the middle of a rigorous training program, that might increase your white blood cell count. And also stress could do that. And then leukopenia is lower than 5,000. And that could be a sign of viruses, really, because the viruses could be attacking your immune system and decreasing the ability to produce those white blood cells. So just make sure you know the difference between those two. Okay, now we're going to get into the next type of cell, which is a thrombocyte. And a thrombocyte is a platelet. Now, these actually are not complete cells. They're actually fragments of cells. So if you take a look here, this image in the corner, I'm going to just pull this up. This shows you, this is going on in the red marrow, actually. Just like all the other blood cells, this gets made in the red marrow of your bones. This is a gigantic cell here. You can see those are the red blood cells. That's called a megakaryocyte. And what a megakaryocyte is it's where the platelets come from. It's where the thrombocytes come from. They grow and grow and grow, and eventually they explode. So what you're seeing here is that explosion going on. And all these little tiny pieces that are coming off, those are the platelets. So platelets are really just pieces of these megakaryocytes, and they break off and then they go into the blood supply. And they don't live very long. They usually only live about a week. And as they travel through your blood vessels, their job, really, they have one job. Their job is to prevent blood loss. And they do that. They have a bunch of different characteristics which allow them to do that very well. So they live in your blood for about a week or so, and then as they travel through your spleen and your liver, they get broken down. So they get taken out of the blood supply at that point. They're kind of disc-shaped. You can see these are the platelets here. I wouldn't really call those discs. I would call them just little clumps, but I don't know. They call it disc-shaped. They're about half the size, but that's also kind of a misnomer too. If you take a look here, you can see that's a platelet. That's a red blood cell. So they're very small. It depends. There's all different size platelets because they're pieces of another cell. Now, one thing they do, a couple things that are pretty cool. One thing they do is they release serotonin. And serotonin, we talked a little bit about before. It's a neurotransmitter, and that's one of the ones that make you feel happy. But out in your body, it actually does something very different. Serotonin acts as a hormone, and it actually causes your blood vessel walls to contract. So if you get cut, one of the things you want to do to prevent bleeding is to make the blood vessel smaller. So by making the blood vessel smaller, it tightens up and it prevents blood loss. So what actually triggers that is when the platelet comes into contact with a tear in a blood vessel wall, there will be collagen that is exposed. When these platelets come into contact with the collagen, that triggers a reaction. And one of the things they do is they release serotonin. They also form clots, and the way they do that is they actually send out these little spikes. It's kind of cool. So when a platelet comes into contact with that collagen, they have these little spikes that stick out, which causes more platelets to attract to them, and they form these little things called blood clots. And those blood clots are made as a temporary blood stoppage. So, a couple terms you need to be familiar with. A blood clot is a good thing. You want your blood to clot unless it gets out of control. And that is when you have something called a thrombus. So a thrombus is a blood clot that just continues to form and continues to form, even when it shouldn't be at this point. And what ends up happening is it could actually prevent blood flow. And what could be even more dangerous is that blood clot can break off. And if it breaks off, it'll travel through the blood supply. And eventually, if it gets to a blood vessel, which is much smaller, it can block the blood flow. And that is called an embolus. You've probably heard the term embolism. And an embolism is when a blood clot stops blood flow to an organ or to a part of the body. So for example, if you have a brain embolism, that would be a blood clot that gets into your brain. If you have a pulmonary embolism, that would happen in your lungs, and that would prevent blood flow and could actually kill that organ. So very dangerous. Blood clots are extremely dangerous. Before we move on, I did want to bring one thing up. Platelets are not the only thing that prevents blood flow. So platelets are a temporary fix. Imagine if you broke something. You might like tape it up real quick so you can use it. So like let's say you broke a leg in a chair, and you want to really use that chair still. You need it for the day. You can throw some tape around that chair leg and probably get it to a point where you can use it for a couple hours. But you can't sit on that chair forever. So think of a blood clot, a platelet as a temporary fix. That little plate, it's called a platelet plug. That little platelet plug, it's not going to last forever. It just stops the blood bleeding for a temporary amount of time. If you want that bleeding to stop for a long time and for that to actually heal, you need like a scab. You've seen a scab before. That is not a platelet. That is made up of a very strong protein called fibrin. And fibrin is almost like leather, and it will hold that cut closed and it will allow that body to heal. But that is a much more involved process than a platelet plug. So platelet plugs are temporary. The actual process of blood clotting, it's extremely involved. It's a 12-step process involving 12 different proteins. We are not going to get into that in this lesson, but it's an important part of our physiology for sure, because if you lose too much blood, obviously that becomes deadly. And the last part of the blood that we're going to talk about is the plasma. The plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. It is the matrix. So if you look here, you can see this shows you the plasma up here. Those are the red blood cells. These are the white blood cells here, that buffy coat where you have your white blood cells and your platelets. It's 92% water, so most of your plasma is water. But the reason why it's this yellowish color is because it does contain some very important proteins, which we're going to talk about. There's really three main functions of your plasma. One is it's for transportation. Water is very, very soluble. So it's a great solute, right? And what that means is things can absorb into it very easily. Solvent. It's a really great solvent, not solute. And because of that, it carries different, water-soluble components of your blood get carried in the plasma. It also maintains the balance of liquid in your blood. So we have proteins in our blood, which allows the blood to stay in your blood vessels, and I'll explain that. And then finally, it's important for keeping the pH where it needs to be, because as you know, enzymes work in a very narrow range of pH. So it's important our body's pH stays where it should be. If it goes too high or too low, that can cause some real problems. Now, there are three main proteins found in your plasma, and all three of them are made in the liver. Your liver does a lot. Our livers are extremely important. And one of the things your livers are important for is they produce a lot of the proteins found in your body. Like, for example, hemoglobin is made in the liver. So there's three major proteins. They're not the only proteins in your blood, but these are the three major proteins. The first one is called albumin. And albumin is something you're familiar with because that's what makes up the white of an egg. So if you've ever had egg whites before, that's straight albumin. Albumin makes up about 60% of the plasma proteins, so they're mostly albumin. And what albumin's important for is it keeps the osmotic pressure in your blood vessels. So what that means is, here's the problem with your blood vessels. They're leaky. They have openings, and they're important. That's important. You want things to get out. Like, for example, you want your neutrophils to be able to get out of the blood vessel to get to the tissue to fight off infection. So how do you have a blood vessel that is leaky and have water in there? And the way it does that is through osmotic pressure. As you know, water travels from high to low concentration. So by having all this albumin in the blood vessel, what ends up happening, it's basically like having a whole bunch of salt, for example. It's not salt, but I'm using it as an example in a solution. What that salt does is it causes water to move inwards. So the actual proteins, these albumin proteins, they keep the water in the blood vessel. So that's why you can see in a lot of people that have protein deficiencies, they might get bloated. And the reason why they look bloated is because the water in their blood literally leaves their blood vessels and goes out into the tissues, which causes something called edema. So if you've ever gone to like a nursing home or like an older person home, you'll see that some of the patients will be sitting there and their legs will be very bloated. They'll look like, they'll be expanded. And that is because of something called edema, which means the water is leaving their blood vessels and going into that interstitial space outside of the blood vessel, and gravity pulls it downward, so it goes to their feet. And that's why sometimes people have to wear compression garments. So albumin is extremely important because it keeps the water in the blood vessels. Globulins are also extremely important. They make up about 36% of the proteins in your blood, in your plasma, I should say. And they're important because one of the things about water is it's great for water-soluble things. But some things aren't soluble in water, like, for example, fats and vitamins. So globulins are little molecules, they're proteins, right? And they have a part of them that are very, very fat soluble. So think of them as like little cars driving through your blood, picking up fats from your digestive tract and bringing them out to the body. So globulins are there for transportation of lipids and also vitamins. And the last protein that we're going to talk about that deals with plasma is something called fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is the protein which is responsible for causing your blood to clot. Now, I talked earlier in this lecture about a 12-step process for blood clotting. A platelet plug is not blood clotting. The process of blood clotting is called hemostasis. And in hemostasis, we have a protein called fibrin. And fibrin is extremely tough, and it weaves into basically a clot, which stops blood flow, right? It's what makes a scab. That's what that is. Now, the problem with fibrin is it's very sticky. So if fibrin were just floating around in your blood vessels the way it is, your blood would just clot all the time. So to solve that problem, nature has a great solution. It's in the form of something called fibrinogen. So imagine a marker. If I gave you a marker and I told you to put in your pocket and bring it home with you, if you didn't have a cap on it, it would draw all over your inside of your pocket. That would be a problem. So you put a cap on the marker until you want to use it. So think of fibrinogen as fibrin with a cap on it. So fibrin gets converted from fibrinogen in this 12-step process. So if you've ever heard of hemophilia before, which I'm sure you have, that's a blood clotting disorder. It's in people with hemophilia. There's all different types of hemophilia. And it's caused by missing one of those proteins in that 12-step process. So you just can't produce fibrin. The cap stays on your marker if you have hemophilia and your blood doesn't clot. So you can take that clotting factor as a supplement. So that's why if you have hemophilia, you have to go to a hospital if you get cut, and they'll inject you with the necessary clotting factor. But in a person that is healthy, that doesn't have that disorder, fibrin gets converted from fibrinogen, and that causes the blood clot. And finally, plasma also contains some other things that aren't those proteins. They also contain non-protein nitrogenous substances. For example, amino acids. So when proteins get broken down, they become amino acids. And then there's waste involved, and that is called uric acid and urea. That's what actually becomes urine. So if you have too much of that in your blood, it'll actually turn into ammonia. If you've ever smelt ammonia before, they can tell when someone's very sick if they're having a problem with their kidneys if their breath smells like ammonia, because that means that they have too high levels of protein in their blood, and that uric acid is converting into ammonia, and ammonia is deadly. And then finally, we have electrolytes. And electrolytes are basically just ions that are in your blood, and they're used for all the different processes we talked about this year: sodium, potassium, chlorine, calcium, manganese, bicarbonate, magnesium. All these different components are responsible for all those different processes we talked about: action potentials, muscle contractions. We need these electrolytes in our blood to go through these processes. So when you dissolve these in water, that's one of the things that keeps your pH where it needs to be, and also keeps the osmotic pressure where it needs to be. And that's blood.